Hello. I've already said hello. Welcome. You may see all of these cameras up here. It's for a few reasons. One is to live stream the event that we're having today. Another is so that I can transcribe what I say, because part of what I'm doing with these lectures is developing a book that I hope to publish at the end of the year. And I find that it's easier to get it all out by speaking it, and I've covered my bases with, I think, 3 separate microphones. Because one time I did this, and I recorded a whole lecture for an hour, and I was like, it's perfect, and I realized I hadn't pressed record. So, so I had to redo it. So this, hopefully there's like a few different safeguards. But in addition, this is going to be streaming out of our live feed on Facebook and so on. So I didn't advertise that in advance, but I might in the future, because that'll give us a nice recording of what we're doing today. So first thing I can do is pass out handouts. So we're properly back in university. This is the course guide. No, there's extra readings if you're interested, but by no means are they required. And that'll be that's for the whole, this is a 12-month course. So the idea for this came from a few things, but one of them was watching Kenneth Clark, who you just saw speaking. And on the one hand, there's something very sort of, I want to say nostalgic about seeing when things like that might have been on the television and thinking, wow, they really used to talk about some really interesting things back in the day. But equally, some of the things he says are a little out of date, talking about primitive people and so on. And it started to make me think that we don't really talk that much about civilization anymore. It's almost, rather than confront what we mean by that or what we need to restore or repair in terms of what that means today, we just sort of ignore the whole idea. So part of the thinking behind this is to sort of see if we can start that process. By no means do I know enough about societies and civilizations all over the world and all over time, but thought give it a go, see how far we get, and see what comes out of the discussion as well. So the plan for today is to talk for hopefully about an hour, maybe less, maybe slightly more, but then also have a lively discussion afterwards. And we'll be doing this once a month. So the first lecture is today, and it's really just setting up the framework. And then the subsequent lectures will be on the second Thursday of every month at a similar time. I'm debating whether to put Kenneth Clark on again because it really entranced everyone. So I feel like now I've got to compete with the master. I should introduce myself. My name's Dr. Eric Liebeck. I'm sure a lot of you already know me. One of the things I've done recently is set up the engine room, which we're in today. And I should say, Yeah, so I'm, I'm technically a senior lecturer in education, and a lot of the questions the university asks is, so what does opening a coffee shop and a co-working space have to do with education? But actually, the original project I started actually 4 years ago was all about trying to develop new ways of giving and facilitating public lectures, because a lot of my research is in the history of universities, and there used to be a lot more extension movements and engagements between university academics and the public, and that's another thing that's kind of gone by the wayside. Perhaps also related to this, I don't want to say decline in civilization, but it's related to the similar reason why we don't talk about such big questions as much. And what I decided to do today was, rather than jump straight in with kind of why do we think of civilization today in a certain way, I put that at the end of the lecture today. So what I thought I'd do to start was start by just introducing one particular definition of civilization that I quite like, and it's related to the Duke Ellington I was playing earlier. This is from a jazz critic named Stanley Crouch, and I think it fits my personal definition of civilization.
And it's an epic vision that is both ethnic and all-inclusive. That's the thing about him that's so remarkable, is that it's Negroid without being exclusive. In Duke Ellington's music, there's always, hey, come on in. So there's a kind of a welcoming quality that you associate with the highest form of civilization, I would suggest. See, because civilization in a certain sense can be reduced to the word welcome.
So that kind of sets us up with a sort of baseline definition, but it doesn't really do very much for us. So the structure of how we'll kind of work through the question of what is civilization begins with Kenneth Clark's Civilization, which we just watched a bit of there. So Kenneth Clark's Civilization is a series that explored the history of Western art, culture, philosophy, more or less from the fall of Rome, which is a classic point to start this conversation, up to the 20th century. And in general, he was trying to understand then, in the 1960s, why civilization seemed to be fragmenting. And he sort of thought, well, if I give my personal view of what I think civilization is and what we stand to lose, then maybe that can help us hold on to it. So throughout the he frames it as a personal view. It's very much his own position, but he structures civilization as a fragile thing that's fallen before. That's the classic decline of Rome observation, that civilizations can fall, and so it's not this really strong, stable thing. It's something that needs to be preserved and sort of held on to, which is what he's, I think, trying to do with his documentary. So here's a clip from the end of the series, which I think is good at capturing some of what I would, at root, he's actually not around very much anymore, but he's a conservative in a very liberal, middle of the road, conservative kind of way. And these days there's sort of right wing and left wing, and this position actually doesn't particularly get represented as much anymore, but he's very much defending conservative ideology as something worth defending. So this is a clip from there.
Well, naturally, these bright-minded young people think poorly of existing institutions and want to abolish them. One doesn't need to be young to dislike institutions. But the dreary fact remains that even in the darkest ages, it was institutions which made society work. And if civilization is to survive, society must somehow be made to work. At this point, I reveal myself in my true colors as a stick in the mud. I hold a number of beliefs that have been repudiated by the liveliest intellects of our time. I believe that order is better than chaos, creation better than destruction. I prefer gentleness to violence, forgiveness to vendetta. On the whole, I think that knowledge is preferable to ignorance, and I am sure that human sympathy is more valuable than ideology. I believe that in spite of recent triumphs of science, men haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years. And in consequence, we must still try to learn from history. History is ourselves. I also hold one or two beliefs that are more difficult to put shortly. For example, I believe in courtesy, the ritual by which we avoid hurting other people's feelings by satisfying our own egos. And I think we should remember that we are part of a great whole, which, for convenience, we call nature. All living things are our brothers and sisters. Above all, I believe in the God-given genius of certain individuals, and I value a society that makes their existence possible.
One of the main observations you can draw from his position and his general analysis of civilization is not just how do we explain what civilization is, different societies, different art forms. For those of you watching earlier, he was saying you can make art, Vikings made art and primitive societies made art, but that wasn't necessarily civilization. And I think, in general, as an art historian of that era, he was drawing on a 19th century idea of culture as something that's produced by genius. And genius is an individual quality, but it's also something that people would consider what are the social conditions that allow geniuses like Beethoven or Picasso to come to the forefront, and how does the civilization reward Michelangelo and so on by putting them in a pride of place, by turning their ideas and practice into art that's preserved for posterity. So one of the people that this is similar to, one of the thinkers, is John Ruskin, who in his address to the Cambridge School of Art, tried to identify what value there was in, or how should craftspeople, people who are going to work with their hands to do decoration or architecture or art, how do you train them? And the most important thing from his point of view was not you need to show them everything and show them how to do all of the different types of art forms, get them practice in everything. It's actually, they need to be able to understand how to recognize the best possible version of art. So through understanding just a few masters or geniuses, in the case of Kenneth Clark, that's actually the best way for the prospective artist to understand, on the one hand, what they could aspire to, but also so that they could start to understand these are things that I actually can't achieve, that it's not the same to do a painting that's pleasant and good and beautiful. That's not the same thing as doing the Mona Lisa or a great work of art. So again, this is the position of Ruskin, and seems to also be the type of position that Kenneth Clark is arguing for, that civilization is the type of society that recognizes greatness when it sees it. So that's the first position. A few years after Kenneth Clark's Civilization came out, John Berger, who was a cultural critic of the next generation, so let's call it the baby boomer generation, it's actually, I find it a little bit hard to believe, but Kenneth Clark's Civilization was like an outrage to young people. At the time, it was sort of, I can't believe he's saying all these things about Western art and Western Europe being great. There are all these problems with society. So John Berger produced a documentary almost directly in response to Kenneth Clark's Civilization called Ways of Seeing, that was drawing on some of the more critical cultural theory that was starting to become more popular with younger generations. So, I'll play another clip of this here.
Not for one moment would I deny or belittle the significance and achievement of paintings like these. But we should not confuse these exceptional paintings, and everything in the museums, everything said by art experts, encourages this confusion. We should not confuse such exceptional works with the purpose and significance of the general tradition. Let me show the difference again, this time at the highest level. Two self-portraits by Rembrandt. One when he was young, one when he was old. But the difference between them isn't just a question of how age changes a man's character. In the first painting, Rembrandt used the style and methods of the tradition for their traditional purposes, as an advertisement for the owner's good fortune, prestige, and wealth. In the later painting, he has turned the tradition against itself. All has gone, except a sense of the question of existence as a question. Intermittently, the tradition can breed within itself a counter-tradition. But the basic values of the tradition win in the end. This painting now has a fabulous price on its head, perhaps £3 million. It has itself become a fabulous object of property. Of course, a lot more can be said about European oil painting than I have said. Yet what I have tried to show is a fundamental part of the truth which is usually ignored. We study other cultures far away as anthropology. That's to say, we study them from the outside and judge them purely according to their own explanations of themselves. Now, if we look at the culture of the European oil painting in the same spirit, leaving aside its own claims for itself, I believe we will find that oil painting was, before everything else, a medium which celebrated private possessions. The tradition of the oil painting has now been broken once and for all. In some ways, publicity has taken its place. The sight of it makes us want to possess it. And publicity is the subject of our program next week.
So Berger's essentially making an argument that is pushing against almost the essence of Clarke's thesis in relation to the relationship between civilization, tradition, and great works of art. He's essentially saying the great works of art in their time are the ones that are going against the tradition. They're the ones that are rejecting the status quo. So Rembrandt, when he's conforming to the tradition, is kind of developing a style, but he's not producing a work of art at the same level as his later work. And in a sense, Berger's trying to suggest that the artist or the cultural critic should be recognizing not what are the great forms within our tradition, within our, what's valued within our civilization. It's what pushes against the grain of that. It's through that resistance to civilization or resistance to tradition that you produce something great. At the same time, he's saying there's no sense in which that's going to change the tradition. The tradition will still win in the end, and in fact, will co-opt that great work of art in a program like Kenneth Clarke's to say, look at Rembrandt, look at these Renaissance painters, aren't they examples of our civilization? When in their time, a lot of these people think of Van Gogh or even Rembrandt was not fully recognized that they're in their time. They're remembered sort of a generation or two later. Now, Berger was pointing to this at the end of his criticism of publicity. Whoops. And there's an earlier, his program's only 4 episodes, so it's not 13 like Kenneth Clarke's. So there's about 4 episodes, and in one of the earlier ones, he engages with the cultural critic Walter Benjamin, who, I don't know how many of you have come across him. He's actually very influential in this whole project. He developed a book called The Arcades Project. And in general, Benjamin was trying to work out how is culture becoming something new in the context of essentially a mass consumer society. So the big question he has is, once you can reproduce art, particularly through printing technologies that would allow you to take, let's say, a painting like Rembrandt's self-portrait and print a perfectly accurate version of that on a poster, say, why is that poster, on the one hand, it reaches many more people, so that's a good thing, that it reaches a wider audience. But there's something that you lose through the act of mechanical reproduction. And that thing he defines as an aura. And the aura is something that you can't really reproduce. It's if you're present and in front of a work of art, it's in a place and time, you can see the painting that the artist has put into it. There's something that's there that isn't present in the reproduction. And what Berger's trying to do through his series is trying to understand how that particular analysis he has of oil painting, and also prior to that, he has another discussion about the male gaze and the objectification of women, which was another theory that was quite prominent in the 70s. He's saying how does Western arts traditions that are put a high place on private possession, objectification, mechanical reproduction, how does that translate into what he called publicity or advertising, or the sense in which we're set up to consume images of a particular kind, and yet they're not very satisfying. So that's the next episode. He talks about publicity and why it sort of doesn't achieve even the aims of its own terms. So the thing I want to highlight by tracking Clark to Berger is, one is quite positive of, say, Western civilization. The other is somewhat more critical, but they're both engaging at a very substantial intellectual level. And Berger, as much as he's saying I'm critical of this tradition, is still dependent on someone like Clark to be there to say, these are the great works of Western civilization, and then Berger can come along and say, I disagree, I don't think that's as good as you say it is, and so on. What I want to show now with the third program is a kind of loss of that substance. So the next program we'll look at is Civilizations from 2018. So this was directly developed by the BBC. Unlike Kenneth Clark's, it's not a personal view. It was probably written by a committee of people at the BBC. And the aim of it was to undermine the Eurocentric view of Clark and replace it with the diversity of culture. And I've put up this, reminds me very much of, how many of you remember seeing the 2012 London Olympic ceremony? There's something about that moment where there was a real optimism in the idea that we can sort of put people from different parts of the world into the 19th century Industrial Revolution, and now they'll feel included in this national history. But it was all very much unreal, because the people from the other parts of the world were engaged in Britain through empire, not through being a factory owner. And as a person who studies quite a lot of Victorian, the Victorian era, there's a lot of ways in which that particular period gets reduced to, children as chimney sweeps and men with top hats and women in very uncomfortable clothing, and it sort of actually doesn't do very much to enlighten us about the way that civilization actually worked. So what I'm going to show is a clip. It's slightly longer than even the other ones, but what I want to draw attention to is it replaces the whole idea of where does great art come from? Is it from the tradition or the counter-tradition? And sort of replaces it with everybody can make art. Look at all this art that anybody can do. And as much as it's trying to be inclusive, I don't know how many people feel the same way I do, but I find it very patronizing. It's very much a kind of like patting someone on the head and saying, it's okay, you can make art too. Isn't that good? And it also doesn't make any attempt to define civilization. It just sort of says, we know it when you see it. And yet, anyway, I'm going to play the clip now.
We can spend a lot of time debating what civilization is or isn't, but when its opposite shows up, in all its brutality and cruelty and intolerance and lust for destruction, we know what civilization is. We know it from the shock of its imminent loss as a mutilation on the body of our humanity. The record of human history brims over with the rage to destroy. But it's also imprinted with the opposite instinct, to make things that go beyond the demands of food and shelter, things that make us see the world and our place in it in a different light. We are the art-making animal, and this is what we have made.
After all, there is another perspective, the art of the Native Americans themselves. Because even the nomadic Plains Indians recorded key events on their portable belongings. It was a traditional art form that began to show the influence of European contact. This image, painted onto an animal hide, was produced by people of the Cheyenne Nation. It's a depiction of the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, one of the few major Native American victories in the so-called Indian Wars. And through artifacts like this, the Native Americans recorded their plight in their own artistic traditions, and there are, inevitably, many more images of defeat than victory. This is the work of people who were the victims, not the beneficiaries of manifest destiny. This is art from the other side of the frontier, art that records how the West was lost. While George Catlin was trying to preserve the culture of Native Americans on canvas, on the far side of the world, another artist would take a very different view of the indigenous people he met on the frontiers of empire. In 1874, Gottfried Lindauer, a Czech artist from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, arrived in New Zealand, known to its original inhabitants as Aotearoa. Lindauer arrived after decades of warfare, in which the Maori had lost much of their land to the British. The Czech painter suddenly found his skills much in demand, producing portraits of Maori men and women. To begin with, the portraits were commissioned by European settlers, eager to preserve a record of Maori culture for posterity. They believed that the Maori, like the Native Americans, were a dying race. But the Maori didn't regard themselves as a doomed people, and by the 1890s, their population was on the increase after decades of decline. And they were absolutely determined to forge a new future in which their culture, their traditions, their language, and the memories of their ancestors were all to be kept alive and kept vibrant. And one of the ways they did this was by co-opting the talents of Gottfried Lindauer and commissioning him to paint their portraits, but on terms dictated by them, to their tastes, and according to how they wanted to be seen and to be remembered. For Lindauer, it didn't matter whether his commissions came from Europeans or from the Maori elite. He treated both as he would any paying customer.
Artistically, the style was always resolutely European. But for his Maori patrons and their families, Lindauer's paintings began to assume an entirely new level of meaning. As a people who had always venerated their ancestors, many Maori came to regard the portraits of Lindauer not just as memorials to their ancestors, but as almost living icons that kept their spirit alive in the present. Now today, Lindauer's portraits are scattered all over the world in museums and galleries, but some, including this one, have remained within a single family, passed down through the generations. This is Te Rangiotu, a Maori chieftain, but also a successful businessman who had the wealth and the foresight to commission this portrait from Lindauer in 1884. Now, what's really significant is that when Lindauer was painting portraits of Maori for European customers, he tended to paint them in traditional costume. But many Maori patrons who had their portraits painted by Lindauer demanded that they be shown in a hybrid mixture of European and traditional dress to show that they were people who could freely move between the two cultures. It's